Hello and welcome to this quick video about the aspects to consider while selecting a spec-driven development tool for our use case. Even before I jump into spec-driven development tools, let's look at the approaches to context engineering that we can consider. In my head, I think about it in two ways, whether your context engineering is strategic or tactical. Now, what do I mean by tactical context engineering? This is more like a plan mode, right? In plan mode, we come up with a list of items to do, in what order it needs to be done, and it basically gives you a solution, and then you go about building it. Once you built it, of course, the plan is expendable, you discard it, right? So thereby, the plan is not a first class artifact. If you have chosen to go this route, then you have one more choice to make, whether you want a CLI experience or an IDE experience. If you want a CLI experience, a good example is Cloud Code plan mode. Or if you want an IDE experience, the Antigravity implementation plan is one way of looking at it. Again, I'm giving one example each just to get the point across. So let's switch from this and look at spec-driven development itself, which is the strategic approach to context engineering. Now, what do I mean by strategic? So the spec itself is a first-class citizen. It is probably as important as the code or the implementation, or maybe even more important, because theoretically speaking, if I have the spec, I can regenerate the application from it, right? Now, with this, again, I have the choice whether I want a CLI experience or an IDE experience. If we want an IDE experience, Kiro is a good choice. This is where I started with spec-driven development myself. I really like the experience of how everything is well put together. For each feature, I can go from requirements to design to tasking and implementation, and I can drive all of this with my steering docs and my agent hooks and so on, right? But then again, if you are like me and you prefer a CLI approach, then you have quite a few choices. I have tried OpenSpec, Spec-Kit, and I'm currently trialing BMAD Method, and there are quite a few more tools out there which you can consider. Now, if CLI and IDE is probably not your primary constraint and you're looking at other aspects to consider, then I'd certainly recommend looking at the levels of spec-driven that each of these tools offers you. And that's a very interesting and important point to understand. Now, what do I mean by levels of spec-driven? Let's first understand what is a Spec-First tool. A Spec-First spec-driven development tool is where you come up with a spec, eventually build the application to that spec, but in due course, it's not necessary that the spec and the implementation always remain in alignment. There can be a little bit of alignment change here and there, right? And versus if you have a spec and that's always anchored, or rather the implementation and the spec are always in lockstep, that is more of a spec-anchored like tool. Now, OpenSpec is the only tool that I have tried till now which comes close to being spec-anchored. The others which I have tried, like Kiro and Spec-Kit, are more like Spec-First, right? Again, if you want more details about where I got this from and the article that Birgitta has written on martinfowler.com, I'll link my previous video about this, and you can take a look at how OpenSpec does the source of truth specification and how that makes it a little bit more spec-anchored. Now, that's one other aspect to consider, which is levels of spec-driven. Now, beyond this, what other aspects are there to think about while choosing a tool? That's where I think about the rigor, right? The number of phases or steps that each of these tools gives you, from being able to articulate what you want from a business, technical, and then eventually a task and implementation point of view. Something as lightweight as OpenSpec, which goes in a 3-phase or a 4-phase process, versus Spec-Kit, which has a lot more involved plan step. And ultimately, you have BMAD, which is an entire agile lifecycle. You go from discovery to plan to solution, your sprint plan itself, and then go about implementing it, right? So again, how lightweight or how involved you want the process to be is also a factor to consider. Now, there are other aspects also to think about. For example, is the tool friendly to legacy code bases versus is it a more greenfield friendly tool? And maybe the last one that I am personally looking at is the tool more of a lock-in versus not a lock-in, right? Which is, if I can use one and I can switch out to another tool tomorrow if it doesn't work for me, that'd be something that I would definitely look at, because obviously when I'm actively trialing so many tools, it is important for me to understand whether I am tying myself down to one tool at any given point in time. Yeah, so there are a few more aspects to think about, and of course there are many gaps in the ecosystem at this point, I can say. But the details of those gaps I'll probably cover in the next video. I'll stop here so that we can keep this video focused on some of the top aspects to consider while selecting the spec-driven development tool for your use case. This is Hari Krishnan. I'll catch you on the next one.